Welcome to a very special program called The American Revolution in Indian Country. I say this is special because we only have this discussion once a year with the representatives from what is today the Six Nations, those Iroquois brethren of the old colonial period, the Mohawk, the Onondaga, the Oneida, the Yuga, the Tuscarora, the Seneca. This program is meant to be a discussion of the context of what brings the Iroquois to Williamsburg in 1781, but it's also meant to be an introduction and an opportunity for you, the guests, to ask questions about the 21st century, about the legacy of the American Revolution and Iroquois. Provide the representatives who are here today to tell you a little bit about themselves in the 21st century, where their communities are, who they are as individuals. So we're going to do a little dance back and forth between the past and the present. And I hope you will have some good questions towards the end of our discussion, about 30 minutes, and then we'll take maybe 10 or 15 minutes of Q&A towards the end. After this program, we have an engagement with General Washington, and I hope you will all come down to see that presentation at the Capitol later this afternoon. First of all, I would like to introduce Michael Galvin, who comes to us from Ganondagan Historic Park in New York. Michael?
Thank you, Bud. It's customary for the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois people, to open a greeting or a speech event with some words. And I'm going to ask my friend Darwin John to give a portion of that greeting to you. But during this little snippet, I'm going to ask you not photograph or videotape what he says, but I'll interpret afterwards. So what happens, I have a lot to say, but I'm going to try to be brief with it. The opening address that Darwin gave, a portion of it, is one very small aspect of a very larger speech event which takes place in Haudenosaunee territory before anything else is said. And so it's called Ohan Galewatekwa, which means the words that are coming before everything else. And the portion that you heard Darwin was giving thanks for your personal well-being, which is not simply a matter of your health, but it's an acknowledgement of your ability to come here with a good mind and giving thanks for that good mind that we're going to share together. And hopefully we will put our thoughts together and be of one mind. So that's preparing you to understand what we're going to say. I'm going to explain a little bit first about myself and what we're doing here, and then I'm going to give the opportunity to my friends here to introduce themselves and explain about where they come from too. I think it's important that I begin at the beginning, and our friend Mr. Woodard gave a little bit of that, but you should be aware that there many years ago, it could be around 12 or 1500 years ago, there was a confederacy of nations which formed in what is now the territory of New York State. And that confederacy of peoples included 5 original nations, Native American peoples, and then later a 6th. And they are known as the Haudenosaunee, the people who build an extended home. It includes the Seneca, it includes the Cayuga, Onondaga, the Oneida, and the Mohawk. They were unified at a time that meant so many centuries ago under what's known as the Great Law of Peace, the Gainas-Hatwoa. And this great law was a commitment for all the nations to support one another, treat one another as family under one roof of a big, long house, and to be of one people. Put aside their differences and any war that took place, put aside the retaliation that could take place from war, and the metaphor is that a tree was erected, which was the symbol of the people, and the weapons that they used against one another in ancient times were buried underneath. And that bond was a very strong one, and a political body that functioned both as a way to deal with one another, issues that were very local, and issues that were national. And this confederacy remained for many, many hundreds of years. And so by the time the American Revolution begins formally, it really is not as, it began earlier, we know that. And the Iroquois people found themselves in a position which was very difficult, because you had on one hand the British Crown, and England had forged a long and powerful alliance with the Iroquois people, known as the Covenant Chain. And that Covenant Chain was an emblem of that agreement which took place in the late 17th century. It was a metaphorical, it was a symbol which united a people. One end of the chain was at the central government of the Haudenosaunee at Onondaga, which is in today present-day Syracuse, New York. The other end was in Philadelphia. But when the Americans decide to rebel against the Crown, it put the people in a very tough place, because those who were once your friends and your brothers as English subjects were now no longer considering themselves English subjects. And they were different now. So who are they, and who do you support, you know? And it can be confusing, you know? It can be confusing for people, and for the Haudenosaunee it was a complex situation. So what happens is the people were divided. They weren't of one mind, and some felt that the bond that they had had with the English was strong, and they should hold tight with that covenant chain. And others felt that the relationship with their neighbors, who were now Americans, really, was more important. And no one knew the certainty of the outcome of what could happen at the end of it. So the Haudenosaunee people found themselves in a very difficult situation. Because the Confederacy had a way to deal with issues like this, they had a system of chiefs, what people call today chiefs. They call Hoyane. And these leaders were the ones who were listening to their counterparts, the women, the clan mothers, and deciding and thinking about what it would be, what they should do. The English were very hot to get Iroquois support. There were many advocates on behalf of the Crown that were long friends of the Haudenosaunee, and they had allies within the Confederacy too. And on the American behalf, it turns out that the community of Onondaga, the Oneida Castle community, and others, which really were the Oneida, the Tuscarora, and some of the Kanawake Mohawks, really thought that their relationship with the Americans was stronger, it was a better choice. And in part because they were listening to the advice of Reverend Samuel Kirkland, who really had the trust of the people, and people believed in what he said. And his first words to the Oneidas really were one of neutrality. He felt that it would be better for the Iroquois people to support no one, and to simply sit aside and watch and kind of be witness to this fight between brothers. Of course, that was a lie, because much to everyone's surprise, very quickly afterwards, he changed his policy. He said to the Oneidas, he said, "It's okay, you should remain neutral. But if you have 300 or 400 warriors who want to support us, and they want to they will conduct themselves as true soldiers, we'll accept them." So what do you believe? You know, who do you believe? And so all of this really comes to a head just at the siege of Fort Stanwix. Have you heard of Fort Stanwix? It's up in New York State, near Utica. And so what happens is, many years by 1777 of this decision-making process had taken place. The Americans declare independence in 1776, and in 77, really, lines have been drawn, and support for both the Americans and the British divides the Confederacy. It takes an agreement which was over 1,000 years old at that time, and rips it apart at its very foundation. And you've got Iroquois brothers supporting the Americans militarily. You've got Iroquois brothers supporting the British militarily. And they meet together at Fort Stanwix in 1777. And the field of battle takes place not necessarily at the fort, but because a man named Nicholas Herkimer is going to support his American brothers in the fort by coming up from the Mohawk Valley. A famous woman named Mary Brant, who was famous for her relationship with Sir William Johnson, alerts the Senecas who are in the siege of the fort, and a large portion of that siege group removes and ambushes Herkimer as he comes to support the fort. And after the battle, one of the witnesses of the battle, participants, a man named Chainbreaker, or Governor Blacksnake, he was Seneca, he said he'd never seen, when people talk about rivers of blood, he said he'd never really seen it until that moment. And it was blood from his brothers and his family intermixed on the grass. And he said that it flowed down the edges of the escarpment. And at that point, in the aftermath, the Senecas find themselves without about 8 of their leaders, 8 of their chiefs, which caused a lot of trouble. There was far too many to lose. And at that point, the divide for the Confederacy was almost irreparable. And so what happens later, because of the support that the Haudenosaunee, some of them, for the British, General George Washington does something which some may know, some may not know, but orders the destruction of a people. And he sends General Sullivan and Clinton up into Iroquois territory to sack Onondaga land, Cayuga land, Seneca land, put it to the torch, burn it all. And we learned later, really, that his efforts were to pay his men and people with land, Iroquois land. And the Iroquois people who supported the British, the Senecas, had to remove all the way up to Fort Niagara in 1779 as refugees of their own territory, in their own land, and had to live as refugees in the shadow of the British fort held at Niagara, and depend on the British Crown to support them for what would be one of the most harsh winters ever, the winter of 79-80. And so for Haudenosaunee people, Iroquois people, what is called the American Revolution is not as glorious as one might think. It really is a story of it is a Holocaust, a destruction by fire. It's an invasion of their homeland, domestic positions in military terms, where your children are, where your corn is, where your food is, your babies, your grandmothers are living. And Red Jacket, he mentions it throughout his life. He said that our women tremble in fear, and our children tremble in fear when they hear the name that they gave Washington, Henedegayas. And his name, he earned for all Americans the title, the presidential title, Henedegayas, which means the devourer of towns. And so this chasm that was created with this conflict is something that people are still struggling with today. In the communities, which are the Haudenosaunee communities today in New York State, people still struggle with this idea and try to repair the bonds. What happens after the revolution is that the loyalists, the Iroquois who are loyal to the crown, are removed to Canada, and they live on a place called the Haldeman Tract, which is today known as Six Nations Reserve in Canada. And so there is a division. There is a part of the cultural core of Haudenosaunee people is at that reserve in Canada, Brantford, Ontario, and the other half remains in their homeland. The Oneidas, for their support of the American cause, end up with 13 acres of the original thousands and millions of acres of homeland, 13 acres today, and a casino. And even the Senecas who hold the chieftain titles in New York State at Tonawanda had to buy their land back to live on from the Americans. So that's a story that maybe you're not aware of or heard, or maybe you are, but it's the American Revolution for Haudenosaunee people is something that is it's not as glorious as you might think, and that's the story that we're here to tell. That's what we're here to do today, and this weekend is to share one perspective, at least, of this conflict. And I'd like to take the time, I hope, to invite my friends up, and maybe they could introduce themselves, who they are in real life, and then what community they come from. And maybe we could do that now. What, do you have a removal phone? Great.
Hello.
Hello.
My name is Craig. My real name is just say that, but I use Craig so you guys can understand. I'm from the Tonawanda Reservation, New York, outside of Batavia. And still live on the reservation. I still do ceremonies. I love it. I would never change. And I really ain't much of a speaker, so I'll pass it on. Come on. Thank you.
My name is Gary Sundown. I'm of the Turtle Clan. I live on the Tonawanda Seneca Nation, next to my good friend Craig there. What we do a lot is acting. Some of us are on the filmography side of making movies. But to share what they want to hear, the reason I came down and the reason I take part in films is to be able to step back into the shoes of my family and ancestors. Onundagayas. I hope you all remember this name, this day, because for me to be here was a learning experience, and that's part of the reason I do these things. I'm not sure if that was the first time you heard that name, but that was my first time. So I will remember all of you every time I hear that name. I hope you all enjoy your day. Feel free to come up and talk to us. Take pictures all day.
My name is Elmer John. The Seneca name is Dolyite. It refers to clearing the path. It's from the Seneca Nation, Cattaraugus territory. We held on to some land after the revolution. One thing that was failed to mention, we were never defeated in battle. We never surrendered. The Americans never said, you lost and now we own your land. The land was taken through fraudulent treaties over 2 decades after the revolution. So, here's Darwin.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good afternoon.
My name is Darwin John. I'm from the Cattaraugus Indian Reservation, about 35 miles south of Buffalo, New York. I'm a member of the Wolf Clan, Seneca Nation. Have a good day.
I could probably give a little bit of context just for how these individuals come to be in Williamsburg, which may be helpful. Michael covered much of the history of the Haudenosaunee during the American Revolution, but questions about how this delegation exactly comes to be here, the league of nations as it was divided with the Oneida and the Tuscarora and portions of the Ganawagi Mohawk allied with the Americans, came to Congress in Philadelphia to ask for supplies during a midway point through the war in the several different times, in 1779, 1780. At one point in time, they were there and they were encouraged to ask for supplies from Congress because the army was not being very successful in getting supplies for their own people. But if the Iroquois made an argument that they needed supplies for the winter to continue fighting, then Congress would approve it. While they were there, they were greeted by the French ambassador. They were very close with the French from an earlier period, and they saw at that point that there was going to be a large movement from New York into Philadelphia area, and from Philadelphia towards Yorktown to amass a large group down here for what would eventually become the Battle of Yorktown. And so the Iroquois at that time were encouraged to follow the army, and they sent down a series of chiefs and delegates with Rochambeau to meet with Lafayette in Washington before the Battle of... And you guys, I would say, you've seen the paintings of the surrender of Yorktown. You've seen the British surrender their arms to the Americans. But during any of those paintings or any of those discussions, is there ever an American Indian delegation standing by to watch that surrender? And I can say that there isn't in the history. It's not known. But this group, the allies of the Americans, came down from New York and from those areas to be a part of this battle, to be a part of this engagement, to see the siege weaponry, and to witness, eventually, the British surrender to the Americans. And after that surrender took place, runners from this delegation streamed northward, spreading the news of a portion of the British Army making the surrender at Yorktown, to cheer on those other Iroquois allies of the Americans that it was a good fight and that the Americans were winning. And so it's an important part of the story, and it's an important part of both Williamsburg and for Yorktown, but it's one that's very much not known. So we have about, I'd say, 12, 15 minutes or so that we'd like to open this up for a conversation with you from the audience. So just like class, if you have a question, raise your hand, and I'll try to work the question side if Michael can direct from the stage with the microphone. So who has a question? We'll start in the front, I'll work to the back. Yes, sir.
How many Iroquois allies were at Yorktown?
Well, we don't have an exact figure. What we know is that there were at least 3 chiefs, and there were a handful of warriors that were along with them. The original group was somewhere in the neighborhood of less than 100 that started out. Most of the contingent went towards the west for some of the theater that was taking place in another part outside of Philadelphia. So this was a smaller attaché, sort of colleagues of Lafayette and Washington, along with some of the warriors that came down. So it was a small delegation. But I can say that there were 300 Cherokee who were late to the battle. They arrived 2 days after. Didn't get here in time. So those will give you some numbers, though.
The Iroquois people, when they make an alliance with groups and individuals, it's all very personal. It's all very personal. And for Lafayette and for the contingent of Oneida, Mohawk, and Tuscarora who come here, they are a year ago they had met with him, made him a brother to our friend Gistalale, Grasshopper, who is portrayed by Mr. John, and made him a brother and gave him a name. And so to Iroquois people, in order to relate further to someone, you have to use their title, their name, and you establish a familial relationship. And so that's what they had to do here, is reestablish that, reconfirm the brotherhood, and in metaphorical terms, continue to hold the hands of their brother Lafayette.
Okay. So when you use the word Iroquois, you mean this confederation of a number of tribes, and then within the tribe is a clan?
Okay, so the Iroquois people, the French use the term Iroquois, the English call the people the Six Nations, and the word that everyone uses is Haudenosaunee, and so it is the sort of the body of peoples, nations, which include those separate, Seneca, Cayuga, and then within each nation there are clans. Senecas have 8, Turtle, Wolf, beaver, bear, heron, hawk, snipe, and deer. Other nations have less, some even have more, but the Senecas have 8.
Thanks for coming. I was wondering if perhaps 30 years after Yorktown, any of the Seneca who had lost their lands came down from Canada during the 1812 war to attempt to regain, ally with the British again and hope to regain some of their loss.
Well, the 1812, you know, the conflicts of the War of 1812 that took place, that had Senecas involved in them, took place within on the lake borders. So Lake Erie, Lake Ontario, Fort Niagara. And this is an extension of what took place in the American Revolution, because now you have a large group of Six Nations people who are still loyalists living in Canada. And then you have their brothers on the other side of the border, and now the Tuscaroras live in Lewiston, just aside Fort Niagara. So the conflicts were not down here. They didn't worry about down here. They were worried about their homes still, up in what is now New York State. So the conflicts that's a whole different discussion. The War of 1812, and you probably won't hear much about it in the U.S. because the U.S. didn't win. Yes. Well, we have a question.
I wanted to thank you for being here, like the last questioner, but I was interested in when and how the Iroquois made the transition to musketry from traditional weapons.
Well, okay, as soon as they met the earliest European explorers, it was pretty evident that firearms were devastating. One of the earliest accounts of how devastating took place in 1601 on the Lake Champlain, named after the man who did it, Samuel de Champlain. And he actually encountered a group of Mohawk men, and his Ottawa guides encouraged him to fire upon them, and he shot 3 Mohawk chiefs in a row with one shot as they came in to meet and have a negotiation. And so at that point, it was pretty evident to all the people and whoever heard that story that you need to set about to arm yourself so that you have military parity with the people who you are trading with. Because those trading partners one season might be your enemies the next. And so it was pretty obvious at that point that bow and arrow and club were going to be ancillary to the real military prowess of a musket. So right away.
Moving the calendar forward to 2012, how did you all happen to come here today? Were you approached by the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation?
How did we end up here, Buck?
This initiative has been ongoing for a little bit less than 10 years, and partnerships that the foundation has made primarily have been museums that work within tribal communities. So in the case of the Cherokee, it's the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. They have a museum called the Museum of the Cherokee Indian. Michael works at Ganondigan State Park. It is a state park that represents an Iroquoian. It's a historic site that represents an Iroquoian village in 17th century. Is that correct? And part of the outreach was to the museum to try to interact with have a museum partnership, but eventually, not every community is the same. So every partnership that the foundation makes goes through different channels and different avenues. And Michael really is the contractor that does the work on the ground in New York and coordinates, and then there's much behind the scenes that go to put these projects on, the productions. I can say that we've, as a foundation, have been in Oklahoma. We've been in Philadelphia, we've been in parts of Pennsylvania, and we've been in North Carolina, etc. So behind the scenes, anthropology plays a big role in doing the field work in 2012 to do applied projects, collaborative projects, not just with individuals, but with communities. So hope that answers some of that.
Yes, thank you. Can I ask the gentleman, if they can, to explain their uniform or dress and what that means?
So by the late 18th century, it was pretty common for Native people to have access to European trade goods. You know, by 1781, Iroquois people had been trading with consistency with Europeans since about 1610. So that ends up being, what's the math on that one? 180 years of trade. So Native people incorporate European material into their own style. Sometimes they'll wear full dress outfits, coats, hats, breeches. But traditional costuming, traditional clothing includes leggings, which are formerly of leather, now of wool. Breechcloth, formerly of leather in ancient times, now of wool. Already made shirts for the trade, and a lot of small detail, beads and silver and glass and things like that. So the style that we're dressed as, clearly not as fighting men. We're in a capacity which is more formal. So we wear more dressed up clothing. So we have more. We look formal, I guess. Yeah, dressed up. We can't go into the minutia of the costuming, but hopefully that gives you a sense.
Hopefully, if the weather holds tomorrow, you will see a transformation in the afternoon if you are still here, as some of our delegates make ready for war. And there will be a change tomorrow. So I encourage you to come back for tomorrow afternoon's program to see a very much scaled down set of clothing and a visual transformation of some of the warriors.
Tuscarora tribes were the same that were in central Pennsylvania. Right in the center of Pennsylvania is the Tuscarora and Susquehanna tribes in our area, so that was quite a bit of distance, I guess. Correct?
Well, I mean, all throughout the United States, there are places which are named after Iroquois peoples. But the Tuscarora people originate in what is now North Carolina. They began. They were once Iroquois peoples who moved there in ancient times. We can't say when. But we do know in the beginning of the 18th century, pressure from the English was forcing them to leave. And in the earliest part of 18th century, they petitioned the people in Pennsylvania, Susquehannas, for land. They want to move, and they're denied. And then they go to the Oneidas, and they ask the Oneidas if they could join and come under the shade of the great confederacy tree. And the Oneidas accept them. They give them they accept them as nephews. Everything is all about family. Are you my brother, my mother, my grandfather, my sister? Well, in the Confederacy, the Senecas and the Mohawks are elder brothers to this big family. And the Oneidas and the Cayugas are younger brothers to the Seneca and Mohawk. And the Oneidas, being younger brothers, accepted the Tuscaroras as nephews. So the relationship there traditionally is one of teacher to student in a way. So the Tuscaroras joined and lived within the boundaries of the United Territory until after the Revolution, and they find themselves up in Lewiston, New York.
And I would just like to add, because of our relationship with the Tuscarora here in Williamsburg, that it was at the conclusion of the Tuscarora War in the early 17 teens that divided the Tuscaroras in half between upper and lower towns. And it's the lower Tuscarora that first removed, and those that were allied with the colonists, the upper Tuscaroras that stayed, signing a peace treaty here in Williamsburg, because the war broke out in North Carolina. North Carolina called for Virginia and South Carolina to come to their aid. And so during that conflict, there was half of Tuscarora fighting the Colonials, another half that was sided with the Colonials in terms of trade and negotiation. But it took 80 years for Tuscaroras from 1712, 14, 1722, all the way until 1803 to remove out of North Carolina. So 80 years there was a reservation in North Carolina and then communities in New York. And so over that course, they trickle up Pennsylvania, places in Virginia. So it's a long process of diaspora of those peoples moving up to New York.
Did any of the Indians disagree on the Revolutionary War?
Yes. Yes.
That's a short version.
Last question. I think we're on schedule to head out. So we have one more in the back, I think.
did women play in deciding to go to war? Did they accompany any of the warriors? Were they, helpers in any way or actual fighters? What sort of place?
Well, they traditionally and in a broad sense, women didn't go to war, but sometimes they did. We know that the Oneida chief, one of the Oneida chiefs at Stanwix, the defense of Stanwix, was shot through the hand, and his wife reloaded the gun so that he could shoot, and she also put up a brisk fire outside of the fort too. So she's known as a woman who fought. On the side of peace, the chiefs, the civil chiefs, and the clan mothers, their goal is always peace. The goal of the Iroquois people during this conflict was a resolution, peace, and to retain homeland. That's all they wanted. They knew, really, that the tide of European colonization could not be stemmed, and people wanted to remain and live as they always had, in their way of, using their way of life, governing themselves, and retaining what is their homeland, the land that the Creator gave them. And as Elmer said, it's not a matter of winning or losing. It's a matter of what are your goals. And if we look at the East Coast, east of the Mississippi, and the early colonization of this part of the country, it's evident. It's evident. There are so many nations which are simply gone. They don't exist but in a name anymore, And so the decisions that people made during the American Revolution and the years previous and just after, those decisions we're living with today. And for the Iroquois people, they've been able to maintain homelands for the most part, although the Cayugas do not have their own homeland yet in New York State. And they retain a way of life, they retain the language, ceremonies, and have been living as such in hope, in relative peace, ever since. That's the whole goal. So how do you win? If your goal is to just simply be left alone, what is considered a victory and what is considered a defeat, Well, I would say that the presence of these men who came with me and all of the Haudenosaunee people up in New York State, my wife and my wife's family included, that is a testament to the achievement of a goal. And it's a continuous struggle for us to maintain that, but it is one that we've never shied away from. So I really appreciate your questions. We may have a few seconds on the way out if you wanted some pictures and whatnot. But for now, I'm going to teach you an Indian word. You ready? It's very simple. It's ona, and the long part of it is ona giwahe, means that I'll see you again. So ona.
Ona.
Thank you so much. I'd like to invite all of you to join us later this afternoon for an audience for General Washington at the Capitol. And tomorrow, weather permitting, we will be at the Wythe House discussing the plans for the siege. So you can come and see the Iroquois in first person tomorrow morning, and hopefully if you're here long enough to see that transformation into ready for war at Yorktown. We'll move over to the shaded area by the tree if you'd like to come and take some pictures.